The pencil trembled in fingers too frozen to feel. February 1943. Stalingrad pocket. Soviet Union. Under-Officer Adelbert Hall scratched desperate words into his hidden diary. The words would survive to document one of history's most devastating prisoner catastrophes. His unit had been reduced to walking corpses. Hunger had claimed most of his comrades. The cold had finished the rest. Now surrender awaited them. An enemy that despised everything they represented would soon hold their lives. Through the skeletal remains of apartment buildings, German soldiers stumbled toward Soviet collection points. These men had endured months of the most savage urban warfare in human history. They were about to enter captivity that would consume 85,000 of the 91,000 who surrendered that February day. 6 months later, only 6,000 would still draw breath. 4,000 miles away in North Africa, a completely different drama was unfolding. Another German soldier faced capture under circumstances that seemed to belong to another war entirely. Gefreiter Hino Eriksson of the Afrika Korps found himself a prisoner in Tunisia 3 months after Stalingrad's fall. His memoir, The Reluctant Warrior, would later record his astonishment. American soldiers offered water immediately. Cigarettes appeared from pockets. Chocolate bars were pressed into German hands. The Americans actually apologized for not having hot meals ready instantly. They promised real food would arrive within hours. German soldiers couldn't comprehend this treatment of enemies. These two captures, occurring within months in 1943, expose World War II's most striking contradiction. Whether a German soldier survived captivity depended entirely on which Allied uniform accepted his surrender. Geography became a lottery with stakes of life and death. The numbers tell a story impossible to dispute. Soviet forces captured approximately 3 million German soldiers. Between 1 and 1.1 million died in their custody. The Mashka Commission's exhaustive research documented mortality rates of 35.8%. American camps held 425,000 Germans. Fewer than 1,000 perished. Mortality rates stayed below 1%. Behind these statistics lay two opposing philosophies about human worth, about victory's purpose, about how civilized nations treat defeated enemies. The German Sixth Army's surrender at Stalingrad began the largest prisoner disaster in German military history. Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus received his promotion from Hitler on January 31, 1943. The promotion was Hitler's desperate attempt to encourage suicide rather than surrender. Paulus walked into Soviet captivity instead. February 2nd brought the surrender of remaining forces. Behind Paulus came 91,000 skeletal survivors from an army that once numbered 330,000. Adelbert Hall followed among them. His memoir, After Stalingrad, 7 Years as a Soviet Prisoner of War, would later provide historians with detailed accounts of Soviet captivity. Soviet soldiers immediately began stripping surrendering Germans. Warm clothing vanished from German backs. Boots disappeared from frost-bitten feet. Watches were torn from wrists. Anything valuable became Soviet property. Germans who resisted faced immediate execution. The death march began without pause or preparation. Men who had survived on scraps for weeks were forced to walk dozens of kilometers. Temperatures reached -30 degrees Celsius. Hall later recalled watching comrades simply collapse into the snow. Guards didn't bother shooting the fallen. The cold would finish them in minutes. Across the Mediterranean, an entirely different scene played out. May 1943 brought the Afrika Korps surrender to Allied forces in Tunisia. Among 275,000 Axis prisoners were Germany's most experienced desert fighters. These men had driven British forces back to Egypt. They had earned their enemies' professional respect. Treatment contrasted immediately and profoundly with Soviet methods. American soldiers processing German prisoners followed Geneva Convention protocols precisely. Prisoners received medical inspections. Food and water appeared regularly. Shelter was provided. The International Red Cross received notification of captures, ensuring families would learn their loved ones' fates. Lieutenant Wolfgang Fischer wrote to his family from American captivity. White bread, real coffee, and meat appeared on their plates. Foods they hadn't seen in months. At first they thought it was propaganda, some elaborate show to impress prisoners. They couldn't believe this was standard American military rations. While Stalingrad prisoners died by thousands in Soviet transit camps, Afrika Korps prisoners were organized for transportation to permanent facilities. Medical care awaited them. Regular meals were guaranteed. Red Cross oversight was assured. Transportation to permanent camps revealed everything about each captor's intentions and capabilities. For Germans captured by Soviets, the journey itself became mass extermination. For Germans captured by Americans, transportation demonstrated industrial efficiency combined with unexpected humanity. Soviet transportation reflected both vengeance and logistical collapse. The German invasion had devastated Soviet rail systems. Infrastructure stretched beyond capacity, prioritized military supplies over prisoner welfare. When trains became available, Germans were packed into unheated cattle cars designed for cargo rather than humans. German survivor testimonies collected by the Maschka Commission described horrific conditions. Prisoners were crammed so tightly they took turns sitting. No toilet facilities existed anywhere. Prisoners cut holes in car floors or used corners for waste. Water came rarely, sometimes thrown through doors while trains moved. Food consisted of occasional bread pieces tossed into cars. Walter Warter, captured in 1944, testified about his transport experience. They started with approximately 5,000 men marching from the front lines. By the time they reached railheads, only 3,500 remained. During the rail journey to camps, hundreds more died. Death traveled as their constant companion. The infamous Bakovka transit camp near Stalingrad exemplified Soviet approaches. Originally just dugouts and damaged buildings, it received tens of thousands of prisoners without any survival preparations. Toilets were open pits that overflowed quickly. Water came from the Volga River, contaminated with corpses from the battle. German POWs bound for America traveled in conditions that seemed surreal given their enemy status. Afrika Korps prisoners traveled on Liberty ships. The same vessels carried American troops to Europe. While not luxury liners, these ships provided bunks, 3 daily meals, and basic sanitation. Atlantic crossings took approximately 2 weeks. Prisoners received regular meals throughout the voyage. Access to deck time provided exercise opportunities. Medical attention treated wounds and illness. Ship crews, while maintaining security, often engaged in limited conversations with English-speaking prisoners. Reaching American ports, primarily Norfolk, Boston, and New York, prisoners encountered their first glimpse of American industrial might. Cities remained intact and bustling with activity. Electric lights blazed through the nights. Everything contradicted Nazi propaganda about American weakness. Arrival at permanent camps crystallized fundamental differences between American and Soviet prison management approaches. German soldiers entering Soviet camps found infrastructure designed for maximum economic extraction at minimum cost. Those entering American camps discovered facilities often exceeding their own military barracks in Germany. Soviet camps operated under GUPVI, the main administration for affairs of prisoners of war and internees. This was an extension of the Gulag system. Camps functioned as economic units expected to contribute to Soviet reconstruction through prisoner labor. A prisoner's value was measured solely in work output. Those unable to work received starvation rations guaranteeing death within weeks. Soviet camp geography spread across the empire's vastness. Near Stalingrad, camps like Bakovka became initial collection points. In Siberia, camps like Chernihiv, NKVD Special Camp No. 48, housed senior officers including Paulus. The massive Karaganda complex in Kazakhstan sprawled across 1,180,650 hectares. Capacity reached 65,000 prisoners. Adelbert Hall's descriptions of Soviet camp conditions capture the horror completely. They lived like animals in holes. Men fought over scraps of food. The dying were stripped of clothing before death came. No human dignity remained. Only the struggle to survive another day existed. German POWs arriving at American camps encountered facilities specifically built to meet Geneva Convention standards. Camp Hearn in Texas housed up to 4,800 prisoners at peak capacity. It sprawled across 680 acres with 3 separate compounds. Each compound contained wooden barracks with electricity, running water, and heating systems. Camp Concordia in Kansas featured 300 buildings, including a 177-bed hospital, recreation facilities, and educational buildings. Camp Aliceville in Alabama, the largest in the southeastern United States, housed 6,000 prisoners with sophisticated infrastructure, including sewage systems and electrical grids. Hans Wecker, who later became a physician in Maine, recalled his arrival clearly. They couldn't believe their eyes upon seeing the barracks. These were better than German military facilities. Each man received his own bunk with mattress and blankets. Flush toilets existed everywhere. Hot showers were available. Electric lights illuminated everything. Daily routines in American and Soviet camps revealed fundamentally different philosophies about human worth and captivity's purpose. These differences manifested in every aspect of prisoner existence. Predictable military patterns maintained prisoner dignity while ensuring security in American camps. At Camp Concordia, days began at 6 a.m. with roll call. Breakfast at 6:30 included hot cereal, bread, butter, jam, and coffee. Work details departed at 8 a.m. for agricultural labor or camp maintenance. Lunch at noon often included meat, potatoes, and vegetables. Work continued until 5 p.m., followed by dinner and free time until lights out at 10 p.m. Food rations matched those of American garrison troops, approximately 3,300 calories daily. This included 1 pound of meat per day, unlimited bread, fresh vegetables when available, dairy products, coffee with sugar, and occasional treats like ice cream for special occasions. Medical care met or exceeded civilian standards. German medical personnel worked alongside American doctors, gaining experience with medications like penicillin unavailable in Germany. Mental health support, virtually unknown in the Wehrmacht, helped prisoners cope with captivity stress. Franz Müller, imprisoned at Camp Concordia, wrote about their first weeks making themselves sick from eating. After years of military rations and wartime shortages, the abundance was overwhelming. Soviet camp existence revolved around meeting work quotas to earn survival rations. According to testimonies collected by the Mashka Commission, days began at 4 a.m. in summer, 5 a.m. in winter. Breakfast consisted of hot water, with a few cereal grains and 200 grams of black bread. Work lasted 10 to 16 hours, depending on season and project urgency. Lumber camps required each prisoner to cut and process specific wood quantities daily. Mining operations set quotas for ore extraction. Construction brigades had daily targets. Failure to meet quotas meant reduced rations. Basic daily rations for working prisoners who met quotas consisted of 300 to 400 grams of bread, often mixed with sawdust, watery soup with occasional vegetables, and minimal sugar or salt, totaling perhaps 1,200 to 1,500 calories. This was half what was needed for survival without physical labor. Heinrich Brand, who survived 5 years in various camps, testified about becoming walking skeletons. Men's bodies consumed themselves. First fat disappeared, then muscle. Finally, organs began failing. Both American and Soviet systems used prisoner labor, but implementation revealed profound philosophical differences about human value and economic purpose. The American POW labor program operated under strict Geneva Convention guidelines. Prisoners couldn't be forced to work in dangerous conditions or on military projects. Officers were exempt from labor requirements entirely. Enlisted men worked standard 8-hour days with Sundays free. Safety standards matched those for American civilian workers. By 1944, over 300,000 German POWs worked on American farms and construction projects. They harvested sugar beets in Colorado. Cotton was picked in Texas. Forests were maintained in Oregon. Canneries operated across the country. The program addressed critical labor shortages while providing prisoners with activity and wages. Prisoners earned 80 cents daily, equivalent to an American private's pay. Though paid in camp scrip rather than cash, this money purchased items from camp stores or could be saved for eventual repatriation. The U.S. government earned $22 million from POW labor contracts in 1944 alone. Otto Kraus, who worked on a Nebraska farm, wrote about the farmer treating them like hired hands rather than prisoners. They ate lunch with his family. American farming methods were learned. They were trusted with expensive equipment. Soviet labor programs operated on entirely different principles. Work was punishment and extraction, not opportunity. Categories of labor reflected Soviet reconstruction priorities and prisoner expendability. Logging operations in Siberian forests killed thousands through exposure and exhaustion. Prisoners worked in temperatures reaching -40 degrees Celsius with minimal protective clothing. Mining operations proved particularly lethal. Uranium mines operated without protective equipment. Coal mines prone to collapse continued operating. Construction brigades rebuilt Soviet cities in all weather conditions. Reinhold Braun described the relentless exploitation vividly. At first, they had to load 2 train cars with wood during one work shift. Then, the norm increased to 3 cars. They were forced to work 16 hours daily on Sundays and holidays. Economic calculations were deliberate and brutal. Soviet administrators understood that excessive labor combined with inadequate nutrition would kill prisoners. But they determined that extracting maximum labor before death was more efficient than maintaining long-term prisoner health. Treatment of officer prisoners revealed how each system interpreted international law and military tradition. The Geneva Convention exempted officers from labor and guaranteed better quarters. American camps followed these requirements meticulously. Soviet camps ignored them selectively based on political calculations. German officers in American camps lived in separate compounds with enhanced privileges. Camp Trinidad in Colorado housed 2,000 officers, including members of German nobility, doctors, and professors. They enjoyed individual rooms, expanded libraries, and extensive educational programs. High-ranking officers received special consideration throughout the system. At Camp Clinton, Mississippi, 3 German admirals and 40 generals lived in individual bungalows with private gardens. They maintained correspondence with families through Red Cross channels. They wrote memoirs that later became important historical sources. Soviet treatment of German officers varied dramatically based on propaganda value. Initially, many officers were shot upon capture, particularly SS officers. Those who survived faced complex hierarchies of treatment. Field Marshal Paulus received special treatment at NKVD Special Camp No. 48. He lived in a private dacha, with adequate food and access to Soviet media. This comfort came at a specific price. Soviet authorities wanted him to join the National Committee for a free Germany. Lower-ranking officers without propaganda value faced conditions barely better than enlisted men. They were technically exempt from labor, but received reduced rations. Many voluntarily worked to earn additional food, abandoning Geneva Convention protections for survival. The ability to communicate with family profoundly affected prisoner psychology and survival rates. American camps maintained regular mail service that sustained morale effectively. Soviet camps imposed near-total communication blackouts. Prisoners in American camps could write 2 letters and 4 postcards monthly. While censored for military information, personal content flowed freely. Mail traveled through Red Cross channels via Switzerland, taking 2 to 3 months each direction, but arriving reliably. Families could respond with letters and packages containing food, clothing, books, and photographs. Wilhelm Hartmann wrote from Camp Herne that knowing his family received his letters, that they knew he was alive and well, gave him strength to endure separation. Soviet camps operated in complete communication darkness. Most prisoners couldn't send or receive mail for years. When communication eventually became possible, usually after 1947, it was heavily restricted. 25 words monthly on pre-printed postcards represented the limit. The initial blackout was total and devastating. Families received no notification of capture whatsoever. Millions of German families spent years not knowing if relatives were dead or imprisoned. Medical provisions starkly illustrated the value each system placed on enemy lives. American camps provided comprehensive health care, often exceeding what prisoners had known as civilians. Soviet camps practiced brutal triage based solely on labor potential. Every American POW camp included hospitals, meeting military medical standards. Regular inspections identified health issues early. Prisoners received surgeries, dental care, and treatment for chronic conditions. Vaccination programs prevented epidemic diseases. Dr. Friedrich Bauer, a Wehrmacht surgeon at Camp Herne, later wrote about performing more successful operations as a prisoner than he had in German field hospitals. They had penicillin, sulfa drugs, anesthetics, medicines unavailable in Germany. Soviet medical care ranged from minimal to completely non-existent. Most camps lacked basic medical facilities entirely. Disease ravaged camps unchecked. Typhus, dysentery, and tuberculosis spread rapidly through weakened populations. The International Committee of the Red Cross served as the primary humanitarian monitor, but effectiveness depended entirely on captor cooperation. American camps welcomed ICRC inspections completely. Representatives visited every major camp multiple times yearly, conducting thorough investigations. They interviewed prisoners privately without American supervision. Conditions were inspected comprehensively. Complaints were investigated thoroughly. Their reports influenced camp policies and verified Geneva Convention compliance. The Soviet Union completely rejected Red Cross access from the beginning. When Germany proposed exchanging prisoner lists through the ICRC in 1941, Soviet Foreign Minister Molotov personally wrote instructions: "Do not respond to this request." This decision condemned millions of families to years of uncertainty. The real reason for refusing ICRC access was hiding conditions that would have generated international condemnation. Numerical evidence of differential treatment is overwhelming and completely indisputable. Of approximately 425,000 German POWs held in American camps, between 850 and 1,000 died. Mortality rates stayed below 0.25%. Causes included work accidents, disease, and violence between prisoners. There were 135 documented murders by Nazi loyalists. Soviet custody statistics tell a dramatically different story entirely. Soviet records acknowledged 381,067 German Wehrmacht deaths among 2,388,443 registered prisoners. However, the Maschke Commission documented 1,094,250 deaths among 3,060,000 German prisoners. Historian Rüdiger Overmans estimates total deaths between 1 and 1.1 million. The Stalingrad prisoners experienced catastrophic mortality rates. Of 91,000 captured in February 1943, approximately 85,000 died within months. Only 5,000 to 6,000 survived to eventual repatriation in the 1950s. The war's end in May 1945 brought immediate repatriation for American-held prisoners, but continued captivity for those in Soviet hands. American repatriation began within weeks of German surrender. Before departure, all prisoners viewed mandatory films of concentration camp liberations. At Camp Butner, 1,000 prisoners spontaneously burned their uniforms after watching footage from Bergen-Belsen. By December 1946, virtually all German prisoners had left American camps. Soviet repatriation followed completely different patterns and timelines. The first releases in 1945 consisted of invalids whose labor value didn't justify feeding costs. Able-bodied prisoners remained for reconstruction work. Major releases occurred from 1947 to 1948, but 85,000 prisoners were retained as war criminals. Final repatriation required highest-level diplomatic intervention. September 9th to 13th, 1955, brought West German Chancellor Konrad Adenauer to Moscow for direct negotiations. His visit produced agreement to release remaining prisoners in exchange for establishing diplomatic relations. The last German POWs returned in January 1956, 11 years after war's end. Reception of returning prisoners reflected their captivity experiences and timing completely. American-held prisoners returning in 1945 to 1946 found a Germany beginning reconstruction. They quickly reintegrated into society. Their American experience often proved valuable. Soviet camp survivors faced entirely different homecomings. Those returning in the late 1940s found families struggling with occupation and division. Many discovered wives had remarried. Children didn't recognize them. Parents had died while waiting. Physical appearance shocked families devastatingly. Men returned as skeletal shadows aged decades beyond their years. The 1955 to 1956 returnees faced the greatest challenges of all. After a decade's absence, they returned to a prosperous West Germany engaged in economic miracle recovery. Their suffering seemed anachronistic in a nation focused on progress and prosperity. The differential POW experience created lasting impacts that shaped Cold War politics and international law for generations. Individual survivors carried different burdens based entirely on captivity location. American camp survivors generally resumed normal lives successfully. Approximately 5,000 eventually emigrated to America permanently. Soviet camp survivors bore permanent physical and psychological scars that never healed. The experience influenced post-war German politics profoundly and permanently. Former American-held prisoners often became advocates for Western alliance. Soviet camp survivors became powerful anti-communist voices throughout the Cold War. Their testimonies immunized West German society against Soviet appeals completely. The 1949 Geneva Conventions incorporated lessons from these contrasting experiences directly. New provisions specifically addressed Soviet-style exploitation. Mandatory ICRC access was required. Prohibition of forced labor beyond camp maintenance was established. Requirements for prompt repatriation were strengthened. Memorialization of POW experiences reflects broader patterns of war memory across cultures. American camps left minimal physical traces anywhere. Most were immediately dismantled after use. Camp Hearn maintains a small museum focused on German-American friendship. Former prisoners funded restoration of facilities they built, viewing them as symbols of creativity under adversity. Soviet camps left no memorial infrastructure in former Soviet territories. The Soviet narrative emphasized justified retribution for German aggression. In Germany, organizations of former Soviet-held POWs created memorials, though recent historiography acknowledges Wehrmacht crimes that provoked Soviet retaliation. The German POW experience offers enduring lessons for contemporary conflicts worldwide. The correlation between humane treatment and intelligence cooperation influences modern detention policies. Understanding that prisoner treatment affects post-conflict reconciliation shapes strategic planning. Current military doctrine recognizes that tactical actions have strategic consequences lasting decades. The story of German prisoners of war in American and Soviet custody asks fundamental questions about victory's meaning, human dignity in defeat, and the obligations of power. Statistics provide clear answers to these questions. American camps preserved 99% of prisoners' lives, enabling them to contribute to post-war reconstruction. Soviet camps killed over 1 million men, creating lasting trauma across generations. But beyond numbers lie human experiences that illuminate deeper truths about political systems and moral choices in wartime. The American approach, rooted in democratic values and rule of law, demonstrated that military might need not require moral compromise. Geneva Conventions were followed from strength and confidence that humane treatment wouldn't compromise security. This confidence was validated as former prisoners became Cold War allies. The Soviet approach, driven by economic calculation and revenge, revealed totalitarian logic's fundamental bankruptcy. Viewing prisoners as expendable resources created efficient exploitation but strategic failure. The brutality poisoned German-Soviet relations for generations. Individual testimonies provide history's ultimate verdict on these approaches. Hans Wecker experienced American captivity and chose to become an American citizen. Adalbert Hohl survived 7 years in Soviet camps, carrying permanent wounds. Their contrasting fates, multiplied by millions, created collective memories that shaped entire nations. The fountain built by German prisoners still stands at Camp Hearn, Texas. It remains a monument to humanity amid conflict. Mass graves in Siberia remain largely unmarked. They stand as testimonies to calculated exploitation and waste. Between these symbols lies the space where nations choose their fundamental character. German prisoners who lived or died, based on which uniform accepted their surrender, remind us that individual fate often depends on historical forces beyond personal control. Yet their experiences demonstrate that nations make conscious choices determining these fates. The decision to feed or starve prisoners, to heal or exploit them, to allow communication or impose isolation. These choices reveal fundamental values with lasting consequences for generations. How nations treat defeated enemies reveals their true character completely. It shapes the world emerging from conflict more than battlefield victories. The last German prisoners returned from Soviet captivity in January 1956, but their stories continue speaking to our time. Even in war's extremity, humanity remains possible. Its presence or absence defines civilization itself more than any other factor. These parallel experiences provide history's clear verdict on how civilizations should treat the defeated. Their story ends where it began, with individual soldiers facing captivity's geographic lottery. Their fates were determined by chance and geography, but within that seeming helplessness lies a powerful message for all future conflicts. The choice of how to treat the defeated defines the victor more than any battlefield triumph ever could. In that choice lies the difference between temporary military victory and lasting civilizational triumph that echoes through history.